Wherever you're listening in the world, it's a pleasure to welcome you to IsraelCast, the podcast powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. I'm Steven Shalowitz, first reminding you that for over 120 years, Jewish National Fund USA has been the premier philanthropic movement for the land and people of Israel. While best known for planting trees in Israel, JNF USA contributes to Israeli life in so many ways, including community development in the Negev and the Galilee, preservation of heritage sites, supporting people with disabilities, connecting high school and college students to Israel, and helping our brothers and sisters in need following the heinous October 7th terrorist attack. To learn more and to see how you can contribute, do visit jnf.org. Once again, jnf.org. Plus, if you haven't done so already, we'd love it if you subscribed, rated, and reviewed us. 5 stars, of course, wherever you get your podcasts. And we'd love it too if you shared the show within your orbit. We'd also love it if you wrote to us and just to say hello or with any story ideas or anything else that's on your mind. Our email address is israelcast@jnf.org. Once again, we'd love to hear from you. israelcast@jnf.org is indeed our email address. All right, now on January 21st, 2025, NGO Monitor published a report titled U.S. Funded NGOs Praising Terror, Harming U.S. Companies in Supporting the ICC. In the report, it said, quote, since 2021, the U.S. government has funded a number of terror-linked and terror-supporting NGOs that advanced economic warfare against U.S. companies and support prejudicial ICC investigations against Israel. The report went on to say during this same period, millions allocated to taxpayer-funded projects in Gaza have been susceptible to diversion by Hamas. Now, to walk us through all of this, we're joined by Olga Deutsch, Vice President of NGO Monitor. Olga is an old friend of the show. She was our guest on episode 160 that was back in February of 2023, a lifetime ago. Well, Olga joins us now on the line via Zoom from her home in Petah Tikva, Israel. Olga, it's always a pleasure. Welcome back to the program.
Thank you so much for having me. And it is really incredible that I was a guest on your show almost a year before October the 7th. It literally feels like a different lifetime. So it is really a pleasure to be here with you again. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. You know you're welcome anytime, and the world has done 12,000 somersaults indeed since your visit, since the last time you were on the show. And before really you share the money trail to Hamas, for the sake of listeners who didn't hear our first conversation, and shame indeed on them, I'd like to start with a little bit of background, Olga. So tell us a little bit about you, how you went from Belgrade to Petah Tikva.
Yeah, so I'm originally from Serbia, which is a small country in the Balkans, in the heart of Europe, just border between basically Central and Western Europe and what is considered Eastern Europe. I went through two wars in the Balkans, 1992 and 1999, and was twice evacuated to Israel, actually, so rescued by the Jewish organizations and spent some time in Israel, but only to go back and become a Jewish leader in the community, create a first Jewish student body organization in Serbia, bringing it into the broader European Jewish student organization. So you can already understand that I was already always into politics, and most particularly Jewish politics and Zionist politics, because I believed back then when I lived in Europe that we need to fortify the right of European Jews, and I can easily extrapolate that on American, Australian or Canadian Jews in their respective countries and fight for the equal rights and equal share of the decision-making process. But when I eventually moved to Israel, I understood that I really need to invest on both building bridges between Israel and the global Jewish community, but also defending Israel internationally. In between, because my degrees are in business, financing, banking, and insurance. So also not a coincidence that I ended up at NGO Monitor doing exactly what it does. I worked for 3 years in Munich, Germany, in a consulting company, and following that, moved to Brussels, the capital of European Union, to preside over an umbrella organization, European Union of Jewish Students, which is the political representative body of European Jewish youth, 180,000 of them, which in American terms might sound like a modest number, but for European standards, it's huge and it really represents a big constituency. And after that, I moved to Israel because I decided that unless I make it my home, at that point, I will just probably stay somewhere around the world. And it has always been my dream to live in Israel, where as you said, now I'm dialing in from Petah Tikva, where I live with my family. I'm married. I have two boys that are 12 and 8, and they're probably a bigger challenge than fighting anti-Semites around the world.
Especially at that age, right?
Exactly.
So you speak Serbian, you speak English, obviously, you speak Hebrew, you speak German.
German. And
Anything else?
I recently realized through my Zionist activities, because I was participating in Zoom calls organized by the Ukrainian Zionist Federation, that I can actually go through a full political conversation in Russian and only reply in English. So I understand Russian, turns out.
Oh, clearly, Olga, you're an underachiever. All right, let's then talk about NGO Monitor again. For any listener that didn't hear that first conversation, what's the mandate of the organization? It was founded what in 2002, if I'm not mistaken.
It was founded in 2002 by an American Jewish professor, Professor Gerald Steinberg, who is still the president of the organization. It was founded right after the notorious UN Conference on Racism in Durban, South Africa in 2001. Some of your listeners might know that that is basically the conference that institutionalized the line Zionism is racism. And basically, what happened there is that in parallel to the official UN conference with, heads of states present, talking about how to fight racism globally, and symbolically they brought it to South Africa, right? There was a parallel NGO civil society summit where the leaders of the summit were the biggest human rights organizations globally, such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Oxfam, names that everyone anywhere around the world can recognize, and typically thinks that they're amazing because they fight for human rights, and they fight for those whose rights are underrepresented in different countries around the world. But instead of promoting human rights and instead of focusing on how they can better fight racism globally, it turned into an anti-Israel, anti-Jewish rally where they had mass demonstrations, and they were chanting, Zionism is racism, Israel is an apartheid state. Some of this sounds familiar to you after October the 7th, right? That Israel is violating the rights of the indigenous people and so on. And this is what we colloquially call the birth of what we know is of the BDS movement as we know it today, uh, which is a political movement. Now, the main driving force, as I said, were the NGOs. And our president and founder took a sabbatical from his academic career for a year and said, I want to look into this phenomenon. Why are human rights giants, right? These organizations, why are they obsessing about Israel and Jews? And why are they twisting the reality? And what was supposed to be a 1 year project turned into a 20 years and full-blown organization. We are now an 18 people Jerusalem-based research institute. And depending on how you look at things, I could tell you that we provide critical research into how the civil society engages with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Or I could tell you that we defend Israel's right to exist within the human rights space. Now, both lines are explaining the same thing, but I think the difference between how they sound also sort of is emblematic of how complex the issue is. So let me try to explain
Mhm.
what we do. We follow the activities of the so-called human rights organizations, starting from the big ones that I mentioned now, that everyone recognizes, all the way to a bunch of Palestinian so-called human rights organizations, and all the way to here a random German group called Kurve Wusto, which even in Germany no one has heard of. Because when I go there and I speak to the Germans, they're like, huh? Kurve what? But the common denominator between all these groups is that they say that they do this in the name of human rights, but they basically advocate against Israel and they promote political warfare. Now, the political warfare has many, many faces. Now, before October the 7th, this is what it is. It takes me 5 minutes to explain what we do
Sure.
because it's a phenomenon that would happen behind the scenes and also pretty much far away from the scrutiny of the public, of the broader public, because it didn't really affect as many. It was reserved to them lobbying parliaments, to either relax how governments fight anti-Semitism or how they engage with Israel or to the UN and so on. But I think after October the 7th, when I say that Israelis and the Jews globally were completely failed by the human rights community, I think there's not a single person that doesn't understand that in its full weight. And we basically document how they do that. All our research is based on open source information, which is just a fancy word for Googling it. And we do it on purpose. I just came back from Brussels and they asked me, why do you not use AI, operated search engines and machines and big data? And I say to them, because the argument that I ultimately want to make when I sit in front of governments is that they too don't need special intelligence forces to look into who their partners are. If I can screen the social media of these groups, so can they. And it make that argument is much stronger if I can say that all hundreds of pages, thousands of pages of research that we put forth are based on using only open source publicly accessible information. So we document how they distort basically their proclaimed agenda to promote human rights, and then we intercept that data with what the results of what we call follow the money. Most of these organizations are actually funded through taxpayer dollars, euros, francs, dependent on the country. Very few people know that when we pay taxes, significant portions of that go to aid projects. Now, when we say aid, it is not only humanitarian aid. Aid also means USAID, which has been occupying the media attention in the past couple of months in the US a lot. USAID funds many projects around the world that are earmarked to build democratic, structures, sustainable development, to promote human rights, and so on. So a lot of these organizations are actually funded through taxpayers' dollars, and we combine these two pieces of information and then we come to decision makers around the world in calling them to either cut funding to groups that have ties to terror, that promote anti-Semitism, that incite to violence against Jews, call for the destruction of the state of Israel, and so on. Um, or, and this is an even more important part, to change the policies in place so that the vetting mechanisms, the control mechanisms, the sanctions that are prescribed are better, that the oversight mechanisms are better, so as to make sure that not only today, but also in 10 years' time or 20 years' time, the USAID and the State Department have better policies in place to make sure that no taxpayers' dollars go to terror. Because no government wakes up in the morning and says, "Oh, I want to work with terrorists." But what happens in practice is that knowingly or not, um, and as we speak as well, US taxpayer dollars are going to Hamas in Gaza. Now, a lot of the people, when we talk about, so much has been said about diversion of aid in Gaza and how it is a publicly known fact now that it was aid that was diverted to build rockets and tunnels and, that they
Mhm.
abused the humanitarian infrastructure such as hospitals and so on. But again, no one knows, or at least most of the people don't know that around 1/3 of aid projects go to what governments call political advocacy.
One
Okay?
third of, sorry, let me interrupt then one third of aid projects.
So
That's across the board.
most of the people, when we talk about aid, they think physical aid, right? Flour, food, concrete, steel, water, medications, right? The things that you would think are needed in a midst of a humanitarian catastrophe, such as in Gaza or in Myanmar now, right? But what very few people know is that there's no way of knowing exactly how much it is, but it's anywhere up to a third of that chunk, and I'll explain in a second why, how we come to this assessment. It goes to projects that promote political advocacy. When the United Nations launched an emergency appeal for Gaza for the last quarter of 2023. Okay, so this is exactly the 3 months following October the 7th. Now, let's just go back for a second. Mass replacement of population in Gaza, right? Because they were fleeing from Israeli military operation. The Israelis are in the peak of the military operation. Hamas is firing thousands of rockets. Hezbollah is firing thousands of rockets, like a full-blown war. The United Nations launched an emergency humanitarian appeal for Gaza, $1.4 billion for one quarter, 3 months, where they stated three objectives that this money would address. The third one was political advocacy. Now, you tell me, if the people of Gaza, in the middle of the humanitarian catastrophe, not crisis, catastrophe, need projects doing political advocacy. Now, when we zoom in to figure out what that means, we see that it's a bunch of organizations that file submissions against Israel at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Or in February 2024, right, a few months after October the 7th, when South Africa filed a claim against Israel, accusing it of genocide at the International Court of Justice in Hague, very few people know that 26 footnotes in that official document issued by the state of South Africa led to NGO sources and reports. And Al-Haq, the biggest Palestinian human rights organization and a former employee of Human Rights Watch, sat in the audience on the side of South Africa and were cited as co-authors of the claim. Okay, so
Wait,
this is
so
what,
that's really important, Olga, to highlight that these NGOs were complicit in the ICC activities against
yes.
Israel.
Correct. Now, it would be the same Palestinian organization, Al-Haq, that files hundreds of submissions to the United Nations annually against
And Olga,
Israel.
then, and who's giving money to Al-Haq?
European governments, right and left. Now, Al-Haq
And do they know
is,
that?
they know
And
very well.
do they know where the money's
They
being
know where the
used?
money is going. They know where the money is going.
But do they
First
know
of
where
all,
it's being, but do they know how it's being used?
yes, they do.
And
Yes, they do.
when you call them out on that, what's their response?
So first of all, it's been a long battle.
Hmm.
And I can tell you, and with pride, that in the past couple of years, we actually cut a significant portion of European governmental funding from Al-Haq. The EU stopped
You mean
funding them.
NGO Monitor
NGO
was able
Monitor, yeah,
to affect that?
because we showed that they're a PFLP affiliated organization. It's important for I understand
Describe
that
for our
it's
listeners what PFLP is, because some might not know.
exactly. So I know that we typically, this is a challenge because we're a research organization. There's so much information and it can
Yeah.
sometimes be overwhelming, but it's important to understand. PFLP is a Palestinian terror organization. It stands for Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. It is designated as such as a terror organization by US, Canada, EU, and obviously Israel. Now, in 2019, there was a terror attack in August in which an explosive was detonated and a 17 years old Israeli girl, Rina Schnurb, was brutally murdered. A few months later, Israeli media now basically released information that the Israeli security forces arrested a 50 people PFLP terror cell. Okay, when we screened the names, at least six of the people were senior employees of six Palestinian human rights NGOs, all affiliated to PFLP, but affiliated basically means serving as their political fronts. Okay, now they were not random standby-bys. One of them detonated the explosive, the other one recruited the entire cell, and all of them enjoyed European governmental funding in tens of millions at that very moment. A year and a half later, the Israeli government in 2021 actually designated these 6 organizations as terror fronts.
Hmm.
The Europeans opened a full-blown campaign against that, saying there's not enough evidence. Now, we took publicly available information, we piled it up, and we started a pan-European campaign. We contacted hundreds of MPs, members of the parliaments, members of the European Parliament. We briefed them online, in person. We raised awareness wherever we could. We called for legislation. We resorted to media. It was a full-blown campaign. And actually, we managed to do something that the Israeli government couldn't do. The Israeli government couldn't persuade them, our information is relevant. And it's a catch-22. I just came back from Brussels, so they will say the following to me. If we want to designate someone, we need to do it based on open source information. So they were telling the Israeli government, you're sending us classified intelligence, so we can't use it. But based on the open source information, we cannot designate them. But more importantly, I was sitting in the office of the head of the Middle East section of the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs with our 80 pages report in German. And I was briefing this guy in German and telling him about this particular organization, Al-Haq, that I was just mentioning, right? Which is the biggest Palestinian NGO. And then he says to me, but Frau Deutsch, this cannot be true. And I'm like, why not? He's like, but I know Shawan Jabarin. This is the CEO of Al-Haq. He's a dear friend. And I asked him, Shawan, are you a terrorist? And he said, no. I mean, we sat in this office. This is an official meeting. How do you even respond to that? Like, what do you do? Now,
I would say you're
behold,
naive.
well, I mean, either
I,
naive
I,
or you're ill-intended,
yeah,
right? Or you're malintended, right?
right.
Now, behold, last week in Brussels, me and my colleague are queuing for the security check to enter the offices of the head of the Middle East section of the external services, which is the EU parallel of Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And who do we see in front of the building? That very same Shawan Jabarin, who is walking down the streets of Europe and going to parliaments just as the same way you and I can, because he's not considered a terrorist. Now, it is the same organization that would last year that filed a submission to the UN that said the following: the Zionist movement, since 125 years ago, was created with the sole purpose to systematically apply racist policies and steal natural resources from the Palestinian indigenous people. They meant water. This is now to you and me, it's going to sound completely ridiculous, but
Mhm.
when cushioned in tens of pages of legalistic language that makes references to international laws, right? Then the United Nations, which we already know is corrupt,
Mhm.
right? That they take it very seriously. Now, that's only one side of that. A bunch of these NGOs really, since October the 7th, have upped their game, and they were filing lawsuits against the US government, against the UK and the Dutch government, and trying to prevent our governments from supplying arms to Israel when Israel needs it the most. It was an existential thing. So basically, trying to abuse the legal systems to impose an arms embargo, not as a political tool, but as a legal tool. And I can go on and on in examples of how this campaign materializes.
So to put a pin in that just for a moment, what you're saying is these European governments and the United States are funding NGOs like Al-Haq. They are then in turn funding PFLP, which is a terrorist organization. And you have people in, for example, like you just said, in Germany, and I'm sure in other countries, that have either A, no idea that this is happening, or B, they're naive to it, in other words, or C, they're malintended and they know exactly what they're doing. That's really what the issue is. So it's taxpayer money from my pocket, from European pockets, going then to these NGOs that in turn are being that the money is being funneled then to terrorist organizations.
So here's the thing. I don't want to say that it's being funneled to terror organizations because I cannot prove that, but here's how you need to look at it. Terror organizations today understand that they don't necessarily achieve their ultimate goal by merely resorting to terror, physical terror, right? A terror attack or hijacking, or they understand that today wars are waged through spreading and expanding your sphere of influence and through political advocacy.
And
So
disinformation.
and disinformation. So they are basically, think of it as they're an extended arm, an extended political arm of Hamas and Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah, where they have two goals. Number one is to normalize all these organizations and have them portrayed globally not as terror groups,
You mean the
but
NGOs or the terror groups?
no, the terror organizations, but the NGOs, their goal of this political campaign is to, on one hand, normalize them, right? By not referring to them as terrorists, but referring to them as freedom fighters, militants,
You mean like PFLP
or Hamas.
or
That's how
Hamas?
you have a BBC report, right, a couple of months ago, that instead of that refuses to call Hamas a terrorist organization. And since when can that be a political discussion even? But when you have years of campaigning for this, it normalizes it. But even more so, the goal of this campaign is to sometimes even romanticize it and to wage a political war against Israel by inverting the truth. So it's not really the terrorist organizations who are shooting thousands of rockets, and it's not Hamas that still keeps 59 Israeli hostages right in the tunnels, and it's not Hezbollah that has been shooting rockets at Israelis for a year. It's actually the Israelis who are the fault, and it's all just, as they refer to it, popular resistance against the occupation, and so on and so on. The goal is to basically portray Israel as a pariah state. Think, is there anything worse today in the 21st century than to call one a human rights violator, right? A racist project, an apartheid, a genocidal people. And this is the core of the campaign. And the NGOs are the centerpiece there. Now I'll raise you on it and bring it much closer to home to you in the US. The entire campaign on campuses and everything that happened
That's
that
what I
took
wanted
place
to ask
there,
you about was what's
the
going on in college
main
campuses.
driving the main driving forces were NGOs.
Yeah.
None of this was organically or spontaneously organized, right? It was all orchestrated and spearheaded by NGOs, and then you had students thinking that they're fighting for human rights who were like just joining the fight, but it was well funded. We actually this past summer we issued a separate report. We mapped out organizations that were involved in US campus violence and anti-Israel and anti-Semitic riots and encampments, and we mapped at least 158 NGOs. And when we zoomed in and we tried to connect the dots, we found at least 2,000 connections between them. Some of them were advocacy groups, so lobbying the Congress and local authorities and so on. Some of them were grassroots. Some of them were research, basically producing reports or basically producing evidence of,
Mhm.
Jews and Israelis doing this or that. And a group of them are funders. They're raising funds, but they all led to the same few fiscal sponsors, which is when you map that, you understand that it's a campaign and they're all fully networked. So
Ol-
all of these are just to basically bring it back to, and remember, we're still in your question of what is it that NGO Monitor do. Uh, Because our research touches on
We can
all
assure our
these.
listeners this episode won't go on for 12 hours, although it can go on for 12 hours.
No, but it's just to say that our
Yeah.
research touches on all these because these are all the different
Yes.
battlefields on which human rights are abused as a term, right? To vilify Jews and the state of Israel.
Yeah, I'm so glad you shared all that, Olga, because that's really what I wanted to get across for our dear listeners in this conversation. Really. So thank you for allowing me then to sit back and listen here. I want to just reference a couple of points made in the report that I highlighted at the top of the program again from January 21, 2025. U.S. funded NGOs praising terror, harming U.S. companies, and supporting the ICC. You did tick off in there a couple of organizations that I would just like to bring to the attention of our listeners, and also one or two I don't believe that are in there. And then I have a whole bunch of other points that I want to raise.
Sure.
The first one is Mercy Corps. I know someone that used to work for Mercy Corps, and what should we know about them?
So exactly, there's Mercy Corps and there's another US based 5013C, right? Registered organization, ANIRA.
Yes, that stands
Um,
for the American Near East Refugee Aid.
exactly.
And that's what I also was going to ask you about.
These are very, these two names are very important. Okay,
Okay.
these are two US based organizations. Typically, we would, raise awareness on Palestinian groups, and then it's some will say it's a no-brainer, that a lot of them are terror fronts or so on. But these are two US organizations, and we discovered something that even we didn't think we would find such a it's really a smoking gun because we found uh, tens of millions of US taxpayers' dollars, mainly through USAID, that went to these two organizations that then worked with Gaza-based Ministry of Social Development, which is a Hamas-operated ministry. And the projects that they worked on with the ministry, basically with Hamas, is cash aid assistance allocations. So just pause for a second and figure out that in the middle of the war, two US based organizations are getting hundreds, like one of the grants is 90 something million dollars, right? Um, which are distributed to households in Gaza in cash based on Hamas priority lists. This is basically what it is. Now, there's no question
What's a
that
Hamas priority list?
they decide which households should get them. They provide to ANIRA and Mercy Corps which families, which households are top of the priority. Now, there's no question that families in Gaza are in dire need of aid, right? There's no question that humanitarian organizations should be allowed to work in conflict-ridden areas, including in Gaza. But there is absolutely no question that this must not be done with Hamas or through Hamas. Now, to put that in a broader context, that same Ministry of Social Development is ran by the same guy who, before assuming the position of the head of that ministry, was Hamas's person in charge of all the border crossings. Now, if you think that whenever someone diverts aid, right, in Gaza, the aid comes through different crossings. They basically smuggled everything, either
Hmm.
through Egypt or through the Israeli crossings. So this is clearly not a coincidence. We raised this issue now. We are raising this issue in DC. I was just there 3 weeks ago and I had a series of meetings. And my colleague just came back from Washington, where he also briefed tens of offices. Um, it's emblematic of a much more systematic problem, which is the existing ways of checking where the money goes are just not sufficient to respond to the needs of the current very complex circumstances. because aid is not only distributed physically. Now, even physical aid is very difficult to trace and track and control. We have all seen pictures and reports where physical humanitarian aid was being stolen violently from the trucks, and how Hamas people were then trading and selling it on black market in Gaza.
Right.
But when it's cash, there's no way of tracing cash, right? It just goes. And now it's not a new phenomenon. They had USAID and other governments work with the same system in Lebanon. We trace similar projects that involved other organizations like Norwegian Refugee Council, or even in Yemen with Houthis. Um,
Yeah,
so
I'm
it's
glad you brought up the Norwegian. Well, I'm sorry,
no, no, go ahead.
There's the Norwegian People's Aid, which
Yes,
is a different organization because in your report, you said that in quote, since 2020, the US has allocated hundreds of millions in taxpayer funds to NGOs targeting US companies for divestment and boycott due to their business relationships with Israel. And you cited the NPA, the Norwegian People's Aid, is one
yes.
example. What should we know about that, Olga?
So the Scandinavian countries, right,
Hmm.
are very well known for spearheading human rights and humanitarian work. So that's how why you have um, Norwegian People's Aid, a major humanitarian organization, and Norwegian Refugee Council, the
Hmm.
biggest organization around the world that is supposed to be catering for refugees and humanitarian, tending to the challenges and needs of any situation where there's a refugee and situation or humanitarian crisis. Both, and there's more. I can add and more organizations in each of the countries. Like in Sweden, it's Swedish Aid, and there's a bunch of church organizations, and then Trocre. Like I can go country by country and
Sure.
name similar organizations, but let's focus on these two. On one hand, the Norwegian Refugee Council, it's super funny, has been lobbying, including US government, for years now to relax anti-terror vetting. Let that linger with you, because they basically say, of course, if we work in a terror-ridden area, in a conflict-ridden area, it's a collateral. It should be written off as collateral that some of the aid will probably end up with the terrorists, as long as we just provide aid to the needy. The Norwegian People's Aid is one of the organizations leading, um, actually, the BDS aspects of anti-Israel campaign. Now, they got a 350 million US dollars allocation from USAID. So a lot of money. We're not talking about 500,000, 1 million. These are substantial amounts for very, very serious projects. Yet they have been going systematically after not Israeli, US companies, and trying to blacklist them and basically harm their businesses over doing businesses with Israel or doing businesses with Israeli companies. And I mean, I can list companies that they have targeted and launched campaigns against, from Coca-Cola to Booking to Cisco to IBM to Caterpillar to Motorola, Airbnb, HP, Expedia, and the list goes on and on and on. They file lawsuits, they try to influence governments, they
And
try to blacklist.
This is a Norwegian operation. I mean,
It's a Norve
that's absolutely absurd.
it's absurd and it's
And
mind-blowing,
where are
right?
they
You have
getting the money? I'm sorry, so they're getting the money from USAID, or they
amongst
were,
others, they're
among
getting
others.
money
So
from
let
different governments, yeah,
yeah.
but
So
including
let
the
that
US.
sink in for a moment. So USAID was giving this NPA organization money, then they were using money to um, go after US companies that are dealing with Israel. I
Exactly.
mean,
And
this is like a
this
Kafka novel.
it is, but that's what it is. And now all of it in the name of human rights.
Yeah.
Because they'll say, Coca-Cola, because they have a factory in Israel, or basically a franchise, because it's not really a Coca-Cola factory, right? It's a franchise
Mhm.
in Israel. Uh, they're violating international law, and they don't. subscribe, they don't fulfill the minimum standards of the human rights index that they made up, and thus, they should be they should be boycotted and everything should be divested. It is mind-blowing because it is directly harming the US economy and the US businesses. And this is in the midst of previous and current administration that cannot speak enough of how much they want to rehab the American economy and the American market and the standard of living, and yet they allocate hundreds of millions of US dollars to organizations who work to undermine them.
I want to ask you a question about USAID and what Elon Musk and Doge has done to the organization, to USAID, in just a moment. But before that, though, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, what should we know about them? Because, of course, the halo, the vaulted Rockefellers, right? What should we know about that fund?
So we've been following their work for years, and the same goes for Soros's Open Society, right?
Yes.
And they go hand in hand also in terms of the types of activities and organizations that they support. Now, with these kind of foundations, it is a different phenomenon because when I talk to USAID or State Department or a congressional, committee, then I can actually say you're taking public funds, taxpayers' dollars. You have to be accountable. Like there are certain things that the US government said it wants to do. And if you're using taxpayers' dollars to do something that goes to undermine that, that you're not being accountable to your to the constituency, right? But when it comes to these foundations, they're private entities, they're family foundations, so they're using their own money, and the battle to even initiate a critical conversation around them becomes that much more complex because it's their family money. They can do with it whatever they want. Now, we're talking about over the years, billions of dollars, like hundreds of millions a year, but over many, many years, it's billions of dollars that go into anti-Israel and anti-Jewish and in a way anti-American organizations. Now let's just focus on the campuses, right? Rockefeller Brothers and Open Society, but especially Rockefeller Brothers, they fund JVP, one of the main organizations behind this and promoting, basically distorting the conversation about what is anti-Semitism, how it should be fought. But it's worse than that. Since October the 7th, we have seen a surge in anti-Semitism in North America that was never seen before since after Second World War. And I think, unlike the Jewish community in Europe, that unfortunately, but this is a fact, sort of lives with the fact that there's always a certain level of anti-Semitism. The North American community, and righteously so, cannot come to terms with that because it's just unacceptable. But people are mortified. People are scared. I I recently spoke to a friend that I haven't been in touch with for many, many years from New York. And she reached out and we started like talking and she was asking, what do I do? And then when I told her what I do, she said, I have to share an anecdote with you. And she said, I'm not going to mention any names, but she went to an official reception and at an embassy of a certain country. And there she met um, a Palestinian representative of a Palestinian NGO that had the words justice and equality in their name. Um, and and they became a little hostile to her. And then she sort of tried to engage with them, and then they looked at her and they said, you do realize it's a war of narratives. And I asked her if I can use this, when I speak, because it sort of perfectly sums it up. We fight by using facts and figures, and we resort to legal experts, and we vet our statements, and we contextualize them, and we think of the broader good, and they don't.
Yeah.
They're fighting over whose narrative is going to prevail. Is it going to be that Jews are the genocidal people and that we are stealing, and occupying and oppressing the weak Palestinians? Or is it going to be ours? And this is now the NGOs are just, they're the driving engine and they're the frontmen, they're the spokespersons because by the name of, but the minute you call them a human rights organization, they have a halo around them and
Yes.
they're protected
Yes. And they've done work in other countries outside of the Middle East.
and they're
And
very well connected.
and they're very well connected. Well, as they say, feelings don't care about facts.
That is exactly true. And by the time a report of theirs or a tweet of theirs goes around the world and all media report on it and everyone sheds a tear, right? Over, I don't know, a father in Gaza holding his son who was just blown up by the IDF. By the time that it takes 24 hours and then we all figure out that it's a photo from Syria, no one cares. No
Yeah.
one cares anymore.
As they say, the
And
die has been cast. And this is indeed the problem. So I want to go back to USAID. If you can just weigh in on what Doge has done
yeah.
in terms of defunding USAID, Elon Musk's impact as he tries to streamline the US government, get rid of waste, fraud, and abuse. How do you see that then impacting these NGOs and then downstream the funds that have gone to these organizations?
So it's very important what the new Trump administration has been doing, and it's on two levels. Number one, they have immediately sent a very clear message that it's the end of it. We don't want to talk about this anymore. We want to act. And the number of executive orders dealing with these issues and stopping, the UNRWA payments and questioning the UN engagement and cutting all funds and launching a full-blown investigation into USAID, those are the proof of that. Now, it's very important. It's very dramatic, and it definitely sent shock waves both inside of America and outside. Many have been criticizing it because, they say they will argue, but aid needs to be distributed, and there's many, many existential projects that USAID is carrying, and now they're being cut. Um, so I'm going to try and be responsible here in my answer. I think, first of all, for Israel, what the Trump administration is doing is great because it's shaking the system, and hopefully will cut funding to a lot of these groups that have been working against Israel on a broader scale, right? For the broader U.S. Society, I think it's good to send the shock waves. I think we will have to wait and see what will be the end product of this. And I say this for the following reason. Even if you cut the funding, the aid will go directly through State Department, right? Because there's several ways through which any one government sends funding. So USAID is the main engine, but State Department has its own direct aid projects and aid funding mechanisms. If you only shut down one agency or cut funding to one agency, but you don't fundamentally change how you choose who are your partner NGOs. How do you control where the money goes? How do you condition that money and make a contractual commitment, right? You basically have them sign something that says US money will not go to A, B, C, D. How do you then track and monitor the grant and the grant distribution? How do you, if they're caught in doing something wrong, what are the sanctions that
Hmm.
you will impose on them? And finally, what is the parliamentary, or in US case, congressional oversight mechanism? Meaning, even if there is a congressional hearing and they bring a USAID official,
Hmm.
the congressmen need to have in-house independent critical resources to be able to ask qualified questions rather than just sit through a congressional hearing and get a lovely report, which is typically the case, right? They come and they say, oh my God, we did amazing things. We fed hungry children in Africa, keep renew the budget. So whether you call it USAID or you call it tomorrow something else, there needs to be a fundamental change in how we engage
Mhm.
with these non-governmental organizations.
Yeah, as I understand it, some of the programs within USAID were cut. Some of these, I'm going to use the term nonsense programs, you know, gender reaffirming whatever in Bangladesh or, DEI, who knows what in whatever African country. Those are the programs that have been cut. And sir, in terms of some of the development, the real important work that needs to go on where the US has to have a presence. It's my understanding that that's been moved into the State Department. And I would have to imagine with what Doge has been doing across the board, that there will be accountability for any future programs so that we don't see that waste, fraud, and abuse rearing its ugly head again. But to your point, absolutely, those guards have to be put in there so that we don't see this happening again, because it could potentially happen again. And it then goes, Olga, to the whole point of people, really. Because at the end of the day, these organizations are run by people, whether it's the State Department, whether it's these aid organizations around the world. And so I don't know if I have a question in particular, but how do we reach these people um, to affect any sort of change? I mean, where does that even begin? Because we're seeing what's going on in college campuses. I mean, to take a really huge step back, okay? So a friend of mine was a New York school public teacher, New York public school teacher. That's what I wanted to say. Without going into too long of a story, she was actually attacked by seventh graders in her school here in New York City. I won't go into the whole story, just in the interest of time, but what she's Jewish, and she said to me, look, part of the issue is that the young teachers that are coming into the school system are going to all the CUNY, the City University of New York
Mm-hmm.
schools. They're the ones that are being indoctrinated, and they're the ones that are being trained and educated. They graduate, then they go into the schools, the elementary, the primary, the high schools, and then they start teaching. And they start teaching what they've learned. And it's this vicious cycle. So, what I'm really concerned about is 20 years from now, that you have these teachers that have taught these students, they've been indoctrinated, and then the cycle will begin. It's like what happened with UNRWA. I mean, if you look at the kids that were educated when Israel disengaged in 2005, they're the
Mm-hmm.
ones that, among others, that were going into Israel and attacked Israel on October 7th. So that's a big concern. So, I mean, I don't know if this is in the wheelhouse of NGO Monitor, but from what you've seen and what you've heard and what you know, like where do you even begin to affect that change, Olga?
Okay, it's a super complex question, and it definitely goes way beyond what NGO Monitor is
Hmm.
mandated to do or can do, right? Because we're a research
Yeah,
organization
that's what
and we
I
try
said.
to,
It's way beyond. Yeah.
yeah, but that doesn't mean I don't have an opinion on
Well, that's why I
it.
asked Olga, because I know you have an opinion about most everything. And that's why we love Olga.
Um, I think it's not one thing or one approach that will suffice, right? You and I had just before starting recording this, you and I had a conversation, or am I enough? I'm never enough. Um,
That
I
would, by the way,
think,
for you, our dear listeners, that was my question to Olga, is that we're living in a day where we're just seemingly never enough. Anyway,
and we truly are not at the end of the day,
yeah.
because I think
As much as all those pop psychologists out there want to tell us we are, we really aren't.
because I think it takes a village.
Yeah,
It really does,
it
and I
does.
think I think there are multiple levels on which we should, to my mind, um, look at the situation right now and mobilize.
Yeah,
Okay, so let's start with the easiest one, and this is my sphere of expertise, meaning NGO Monitor. We're never gonna eradicate all haters. There's always gonna be hate. But what we can do, we can continue to work with our respective governments and authorities, local, regional, national, and regulate, regulate, regulate. Just like a parallel, a white supremacist, a neo-Nazi skinhead in US. Like, yes, there's freedom of speech, and as opposed to Europe, you can say just about anything. But yet, if it is proven that you are a neo-Nazi activist, right, a white supremacist, the law dictates and prescribes certain things. You're going to be recognized as a criminal, right?
Yeah.
There's a legal remedy. When it comes to a pro-Palestinian activist that screams at a university or on the streets of New York, from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free, global intifada, there's no such legal remedy. So we have to regulate and thus educate, right? What is okay and what is not okay. You're entitled to hate me. You're entitled to think whatever you want, but just be aware that if you say it in a public forum, you might be sanctioned and legally prosecuted. So I think in that sense, we have to do a better job and continue to work with the authorities. What constitutes anti-Semitism? What violates us? And we need to do a better job at saying that in one voice, because we have allowed for a global conversation. This is not only a US situation, it's a global one where others get to tell us, the Jews, what is anti-Semitic to us. If you invert that, just picture a situation where the Jewish community, where the Conference of Presidents, right, in US, said we want to be part of the policy conversation on what constitutes Islamophobia today. I mean, just imagine the headlines,
Yeah.
right? It would like the world would go crazy. Yet when it comes to what constitutes anti-Semitism, everyone has an opinion and becomes an expert. When the previous administration, right, drew a State Department strategy on combating anti-Semitism, they allowed for the IHRA working definition on anti-Semitism to be relativized by citing an additional one. This is how we basically allow for anyone to say, for me, saying that I'm an anti-Zionist is not anti-Semitic. For you, it might be, but for me, it's not. And because the State Department strategy on combating anti-Semitism allows both, then it's okay. It's
Yeah.
not okay. So that's on a policy level. Now, on a communal level, I think we need to mobilize ourselves and do a better job at both educating ourselves, and I deliberately don't say only the young people, because even people of my age and older, unless they're very engaged in this and do this professionally, are not educated enough. Now, that's not criticism. Luckily, we didn't have to, because there was not that much anti-Semitism. But the game has changed. And now we all feel threatened and violated, and our kids are threatened and violated. And it is most certainly not okay that a Jewish couple in the US in 2025 needs to ask themselves which school to send their kids to in September based on where anti-Zionists might persecute them. That
Yeah.
that is ridiculous. And we need to do a better job at also mobilizing our communities and mobilizing our constituency. And then the Jewish communities need to do a better job at serving as a resource to their constituency. Legal advice, psychological advice, guidance, on-site help, assistance with schools, with authorities. A lot of the parents don't want to be the front men. They don't
Mhm.
want to be fighters, but they would gladly have someone else help them, right? And finally, where relevant, and in many cases it is, we also need to resort to legal tools. We need to sue these groups. They need to be held accountable. At the end of the day, it's transparency, and this is what NGO Monitor stands for. It's very simple. It's transparency and accountability. I come from the business sector, so I like to compare everything with markets. When it comes to the private sector, and when it comes to the public sector, we have set of standards. You need to be transparent, right? An elected official or a business person they need to say, I support this one. I spend money on that. We engage with this. This is our affiliate. This partner of ours is affiliated with such and such. And if that is problematic, I'm gonna distance myself from it publicly, right? And accountability, meaning if we have public like leaders, elected officials, and professionals, like governmental officials, as well as private CEOs and leaders of the private companies that can be fired over one tweet within
Yeah.
a few hours. Only when it comes to the civil society, which includes universities, think tanks, NGOs, both these values are thrown through the window. None of
Yep.
that. They neither have to be transparent, going back to campuses. We don't know who's funding what there, right? And then somehow we realize that it's Saudis and Qatar that are funding, like in Texas, the Qataris are funding the nuclear program in Texas. It is mind-blowing. And we need to hold them accountable. You want to take Qatari money, then you have to be accountable to that, and then you have to be ready to bear the consequences. Because if our country has a diplomatic position on another country,
Hmm.
then it cannot be that an institution operating on US soil can have a contradicting policy vis-a-vis that country. Again, the wars today are not waged mainly with weapons. They're waged economically, by propaganda, by spreading the sphere of influence. And we need to adapt what we do to that new reality.
Olga, just two really, really quick points before we move on, because I'm super mindful of your time. So at the end of the day, NGO Monitor produces these absolutely fantastic, very robust reports. And then just share briefly what you do with that intel.
So we take it to elected officials and to parliaments and to governments, and we raise awareness and we contextualize them also within the legislative system of each country because we study it first. So we know what are the existing policies, what are the loopholes, and we are able to make practical recommendations. And then also cross-reference and sit in DC and say, the Europeans already did ABC. You should look into that too. Um, and we've been able over the last 5, 6 years, just by sharing our research, to see at least 150 million US dollars cut in governmental funding from anti-Israel NGOs. I say at least because, again, this field is completely not transparent, so we oftentimes don't even know, right? But more importantly, and it is a global trend, the things might look grim to any one of us looking and suffering from all these anti-Semitic attacks and so on. But there is a trend. It's a slow but steady trend of governments picking up this issue and tightening their legislations, and especially since October the 7th. Let me just reference, to me, the most historical one since October the 7th. In November 2024, the German parliament, Bundestag, passed a resolution, which is a binding one, so it's an equivalent to a law, that says anyone who does not recognize Israel's right to exist will not get any German money on German soil or outside of it. Let that now, part of you will say it's unbelievable that we need this, right, in 21st century, but think beyond that, how historical it is. That, and by the way, the Dutch government followed suit, and in February this year, legislated a similar law. Basically, they're saying we're not going to engage with German NGOs or entities or Palestinian ones if they don't say Israel has the right to exist. This is the lowest common denominator. It has nothing to do where the borders will be. That is a political question that will be negotiated when the conditions are right. But the bare fact, just like they demand, by the way, they demand from Israel to recognize the right of the Palestinian people. But now they're saying after October the 7th, well, you Palestinians have to do the same when it comes to Israel. And we have been apologetic so far, right? But now we want you to sign that in the contract. And I can tell you that within the first couple of weeks, they actually cut funding to a few organizations. One of these groups tweeted or put it on their social media. It was, it was so funny that it ended up being pathetic and ridiculous. They said that they were summoned to the German embassy in Tel Aviv, and they kept asking them repeatedly, do you recognize Israel's right to exist? And they could not bring themselves to say yes. And then the embassy said, well, we are really sorry, but we have to terminate the German grant to you. I mean, this is the fight. They do not want us here. And we need to do a better job at demanding exactly that. When you put it out there so bluntly and so raw that no one can deny it, right? They didn't ask them, do you think that every form of Palestinian resistance is anti-Semitic? No. Do you recognize Israel's right to exist? That is the lowest common denominator. So these are the things that we work with governments to try to basically tweak their existing policies, introduce new ones, so that the long-term effect is there and not just cutting funding. And the third goal, and that is by and large discrediting these groups and poking that halo right around them. And I think that we have pretty much succeeded in that last one. Because if 20 years ago, when Professor Steinberg created NGO Monitor, people thought he was crazy when he said that Human Rights Watch, has an obsession about Israel and that Amnesty International is writing reports that are anti-Semitic. I think today there's not a single Jew or Israeli who doesn't take this for granted. Like no one takes their reports seriously anymore. Because and we have been the first ones to talk about it, and we were actually happy when everyone else picked it up as a talking point, because it meant that our campaign and our research, our exposing the truth worked. So these are the three main things that we do. Again, using research.
Right. And then the final question. So you just got back from Brussels. Was there anything that popped out at you in particular in your conversations there?
Yes, it was actually quite surprising that not so much surprising, but it was a contrast between the previous parliament, because the European Parliament just had its new parliament sworn in. They
Mhm.
started on January. They had elections in June last year.
And by the way, we should share with our listeners that we're recording this episode, no fooling, on April 1st.
Yeah, so, but none of this is a joke.
Yes. Unfortunately, none of it's a joke.
None of this is a
Yes.
joke. Um, that the previous parliament was much more arrogant by and large, right? They were very, very critical. The Foreign Affairs Tsar Borrell who, with the previous parliament, was a bona fide anti-Semite. There's no other, and I don't use this word lightly. I don't think I have called any other European politician a bona fide anti-Semite, but Joseph Borrell, 100%. Now there's a new parliament
Mhm.
and a new reality. And it's important to look at the EU, the European Union, through global lenses. Washington and Jerusalem have basically completely marginalized Brussels, European Union. I mean, and righteously so, right? Because they haven't been able to even come out and clearly condemned Hamas and
Yeah.
clearly condemn October the 7th and so on. They would always say, and Israel needs to do this. And there needed to be one statement on October the 7th and then a pause and then whatever else they want to issue. So especially the Trump administration and Jerusalem have completely marginalized them. They're taken out of the equation.
Mhm.
Now, I'd like to remind you, the European Union is the largest donor of the Palestinian Authority. The European Union is the single largest donor of aid globally, and that is the case also when it comes to the Palestinian organizations and the aid that goes into the Palestinian territories. So on one hand, they have a huge role to play. The EU only in 2024 sent 500 million euros, and that is a little bit more than $500 million in emergency humanitarian aid to Gaza. Okay, that's only in 2024. So they have a huge role to play, but they're not being given a seat around the table. So the atmosphere in Brussels is now slightly different. They're on one hand criticizing the Israeli government, we are not being allowed to come into Gaza. We're not being given humanitarian visas to operate in Israel, right? And so on and so on. But they're not necessarily critical. They're basically saying, how can we get a chance to play a more meaningful role? So one of the things I'm seeing is that they will try to proliferate themselves as the as the bridge to the Palestinian Authority, because there is sort of a consensus, despite the public opinion in Israel, that, Abbas hasn't changed since before October the 7th. So if before October the 7th he was part of the problem, how come can he now be part of the solution? But there is a global consensus that the only alternative on the table is PA, right? To take over
Palestinian Authority.
Palestinian Authority to take over from Hamas. So the European Union is hosting a big meeting with the Palestinian Authority on April the 14th, so in 2 weeks from now in Brussels. And they're obviously showing that, or trying to show that they can be a bridge to the Palestinian Authority. And it's going to be very interesting to see what happens, because don't forget, it not only Washington and Jerusalem are marginalizing them, but when these two capitals are marginalizing them, so are all the countries of the Abraham Accords and the Saudis. So the EU, if they want to stay relevant, they will have to really, really fight hard now. And that is a position that we haven't seen the EU in for a very long time. So, buckle up. And it's probably going to be an interesting, at least, I mean, I'm a nerd, so this is
Well,
what
I
I
think
find interesting.
it's going to be fascinating because it seems like there's a new sheriff in town in the EU.
Yeah,
And so how that plays out, we
it's
just
going to
have
be
to really
interesting.
stay tuned. Really now, Olga, before I let you go, and it's just a quick comment from you. As we talk about all the billions of dollars that have gone to Gaza, to the West Bank, to the Hamas, Hezbollah, to all these organizations, I think to myself, you know, that money could have been used to such better and for such better purposes had there not been a war, had Hamas not attacked, had the Palestinians, in the land of what if, right? And I just feel like all of our time, all of our energy, all of our money that we've expended, especially since October 7th, could have been put to such better use had this not ever happened. It needed to, I mean, let's put it this way. The money needed to be spent to support Israel. The money needed to be spent, and our time needed to be spent and everything else. But I sometimes think to myself, holy smokes, all the money that has gone into this.
I mean, it's a question, but it's also a statement that you're
Yeah,
making.
it
And
is.
I agree with it wholeheartedly, right? Who could not? I oftentimes when I speak to officials, and I use this phrase just now last week in Brussels, I say to them, don't do this for the sake of Israelis. Israelis don't suffer from anti-Semitism. You know, Israelis travel the world, shop, go hiking, and they come back to Israel. We have terror attacks, we have wars, we have rockets, but that's a security issue. That's a security event. And then also the authorities here know exactly how to treat it as such. But this politicized anti-Semitic campaign, because that's what it is. It's anti-Semitism gone political, right? It's a political warfare. Um, it harms your citizens, meaning US citizens, Jewish, but not only, because the youth is being radicalized and the
Yes.
discourse is being
And
radicalized
brainwashed. Yeah.
and brainwashed, and the population of Berlin or any one city, but more than anything, and this is the saddest part, maybe, the poor Palestinians. And I know it might, coming from someone who runs a pro-Israel organization, it might sound hypocritical. But I really think that the biggest shame of this is that instead of these money going to build a state there for their own sake, build a society. If it's human rights projects, then fight for the right of the Palestinian women in the Palestinian society, or children's right to access to health, or whatever it is, youth participation, teaching sustainable development and democratic processes. There's so many big words, right? Equality, whatever you want, it all goes to further radicalize the Palestinian society and continue to keep them captive, the biggest hostages of Hamas. They are the biggest hostages of Hamas because they're kept inside of a Hamas ran and controlled closed
Society.
area and society because and they're closed both hermetically because when I speak in on media interviews, people don't actually know that a Gazan person before the war cannot just pull out their passport and travel. That was not the reality of a Hamas controlled Gaza, but also
And that has nothing to do with Israel.
and that has nothing to do with Israel. But also, as you say, as a society, so they're mentally kept hostages because they are being brainwashed to hate and to educate generations and generations to hate and to blame someone else for all that is wrong in their society. And think of the tens of billions of dollars that were wasted instead of building, a Palestinian Singapore. And this has nothing to do with what my personal position is on Palestinian state, where it should be, two-state solution, whatever. Like, if these governments, the international community is already committing tens of billions of dollars to
That's
this,
where I was going with that. Yeah.
at least do a good job. Give these people hope. Give them a
Yeah.
chance of a life. So to me, that is actually the worst part of it, because I always say this, and I'm raising two small kids in Israel since October the 7th. My little kid still sleeps in the safe room, and I went to a bat mitzvah celebration yesterday, only to be seated next to a friend from my community who all of a sudden goes white. And I'm like, what's going on? And she says, we just got a message because their son that was recruited to the army, to the regular army duty 4 months ago, is being notified that he's gonna go into Gaza on Sunday. And you, as a mother, I mean, you know, and that awaits me. I have two boys. Um, and yet I would never, ever trade spots with the Gaza mother, with the Palestinian mother. So no matter what, we still have a thriving country, a democratic country, a thriving society, and a country with all its issues. We rely on our government and we feel protected and we feel defended. Um, and the biggest, it's a tragedy. It's a Kafkaian tragedy that all this money and the international community has to do some soul searching, right? All that money went into further radicalizing them and thus keeping them further away from what they claim was the original goal, which is having them a functioning society.
Yeah.
And when they think in terms of the aid that will be flowing into Gaza after the war, and the estimate right now is that they need around over $50 billion to rebuild Gaza in the next 4 years. The international community has to put a finger on their forehead and say, what are we going to do different?
And on that note, Olga Deutsch, we're going to leave it right there. Listen, this has been such a robust and absolutely fascinating conversation, as I knew that it would be before we started rolling. We can't wait to have you back for round three, and we just want to thank you so much for joining us here on this episode of IsraelCast.
Thank you so much for having me, and I really hope that I did not overwhelm your audience with the amount of information.
Listen, Olga, I got to say, there's still so much more information. We can't really wait to have you back for more info. So definitely, we want to thank you once again so much. And we'll indeed have a link to you, Olga, and NGO Monitor on the show notes page of this episode on our website, jnf.org/IsraelCast. We're also on YouTube. So you can see Olga and yours truly in conversation on YouTube. Just go to the JNF channel and search for IsraelCast right there. And speaking of all things social media, we do release new episodes of the show every other Wednesday. And just so you never miss an episode, subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. Simply search for IsraelCast. Don't forget to rate and review us, because that really helps with our rankings, which in turn make it easier for more folks around the world to find us. and to hear from truly extraordinary brains and minds like Olga's. You can always enjoy the show also by visiting us at our website. Once again, it's jnf.org/IsraelCast. And indeed, it takes a whole moshav to put IsraelCast together. For that, we thank Vivian Grossman, Stefan Oberman, and JD Krebs. And our editor is the one and only Jay Rothman. And the music that you hear indeed at the top until the program is titled My Eden. It's by the very talented Rafi Malkiel from his album Water on the Tzaddik label. IsraelCast is powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. And for more info about JNF USA, do visit jnf.org. And as I said at the top of the show, if you'd like to write to us with story ideas or just to say howdy, I know Olga would love to hear from you, wouldn't you, Olga?
Absolutely.
And I would as well. So do email us at israelcast@jnf.org. Meantime, I'm Steven Shalowitz. Thank you for tuning in and looking forward to having you join us on future episodes of IsraelCast.